Luke 18, Matthew chapter 5. We're going to look at two passages this morning. We kicked off last week a series that we're calling Accidental Pharisee. I brought with me something from my house. This is what we have used in my family over the last how many ever years since our little guys were really small. Our older guys were really small. In fact, here is my height of my second son and my oldest son, David and Caleb, at year one. So that should give it to you. That's many years ago, probably 2001, somewhere in that time frame. And they're 14 and 15 now. And we had this and marked how tall they were throughout the years. This is our measuring rod of height. And so what happens are every once in a while, my younger two boys, I have four boys, my younger two, Isaac and Jacob, will come up and they'll grab this thing out of our laundry room and they'll set it up and say, I wonder how tall I've gotten. And they will then begin to compare to the markings of their older brothers. In fact, I was just hearing my third son, Jacob, say just yesterday, I'm probably going to be bigger than my older brothers eventually. And where he gets that is by measuring up to where they were at his age. Now, if you notice on here, just go ahead and I'm going to go ahead and confess this, you see David and Caleb's name. That's what happens when you have four kids. That's my oldest two sons. They get their names on everything. My younger two borrow it. When you have four sons, that's the way it works. So here's David and Caleb's names are on here, but Jacob and Isaac also are marked on here. And this blows my mind. My oldest son, David, back in 2009, was right here. Now my son, David, 15, is here. And what they'll do, they'll come up to me usually once a week, and they'll say, hey, Dad, can we see how tall we're getting compared to you? And they come up with this macho look like, hey, can we stand back to back for a moment? I'm like, sure, all right, let's do that. And so they'll turn back to back, and I will, in a sneaky way, just barely lift up my heels just a bit to give me a little extra when they're not looking, just to prove that I'm still right there with them. But the reality is my oldest two sons have now measured up past me. They have passed me up. And so their chest will be out a little bigger. Come on, Dad, let's measure up today. And they'll walk over. And we don't even use the stick anymore because this is becoming obsolete except for my youngest two. And eventually they're going to pass this as well, and they will pass me. Now, I will just go ahead and share this with you. I always remind my boys, though, you may pass me in height, but don't forget I am short, but I'm scrappy. I'm from the West End. You can't take me. I don't care how tall you get. I don't know how muscular you get. I will take you out. I brought you into this world. I will, take you out of the world, right? And this measuring stick, it reminds us of how quickly they've grown, how big they've gotten. And really, if we're being honest this morning, all of us live a life of comparison. We live a life trying to measure up to how we're doing physically, how we're doing spiritually, how we're doing financially, how we're doing marriage-wise, how we're doing in relationships. We are constantly living in a world that is about comparison. We live in a culture of constant comparison, unlike any generation before us. We ask questions like, who has the better job? Who has the better kids? Whose recipe gets more pins on Pinterest? Whose picture of a sunset is described more on Instagram? We constantly are comparing. And in the end, what we're really trying to get at is, where is our value? How do we measure? What is our worth? That's the real question of comparison. Now, by definition, we all know that comparison is not a bad thing. For example, some of us are going to leave here this afternoon and we are going to decide which restaurant to go to, and it will be based by comparison. I'm never going there because when I did last time, that wasn't a good afternoon. I'm going to go there because I know the food is good, right? We constantly are making decisions based upon comparison. What vehicle you're going to buy, right? Many of us here, you're going to say, I would never buy a Chevy. And there's a reason why you'll never buy a Chevy. I'm never going to buy a Ford. There's a reason why you'll never buy a Ford. We are constantly comparing, and comparison is good. If you're going to buy a house, you're going to compare the houses that are available to determine whether the one you are looking to buy is the one you should buy. And everybody has different tastes. Like my wife, she does not like a cookie cutter house. She wants a house that is different, is unique. She likes different colors and things like that. For her, that's something important. Everybody has something they compare what they value to. Value is what really the question of comparison is. Now, what happens is that rolls over into relationships. And there's a big problem when we begin to compare with relationships. In fact, we are born intrinsically with this idea of comparison. Think about it. A kid from a very small age is taught to compare. You go out on a sports field, and it's a comparison of who kicks the ball better and who throws the ball better. You go to school, and what do you learn in kindergarten? There are A's, there are B's, there are C's, there are D's, and there are F's. Or if they're really nice, they'll be like, you get a check, and you don't get a check. You get an X. Even that standard, what are we saying? Do you measure up? Do you compare? We constantly are in a world of comparison. Do you match up? Do you measure up? It was funny, I was years ago out with a friend of mine, and I enjoy playing golf. As I've gotten older, golf has become a much more important sport in my life because, you don't really break bones on the golf course, and it's becoming easier on a basketball court or a softball field to get bones broken. So I enjoy playing golf. I don't play as often as I would like, but I enjoy playing when I can. And it's a fun sport. It's a little bit more expensive than others, but when you get out there, there's something about just playing against the course. But years ago, there was a friend of mine. He's actually a head men's volleyball coach at a Division I school, and he actually coaches the junior national USA team. So he's a great athlete. He's a coach, and we still remain great friends. But I enjoy playing golf with him, and so every once in a while, when he comes in the area, we hit it up and play some golf. And a couple years ago, I got to visit him. We played golf. We love playing golf together. But he's extremely athletic and very good at golf. And so whenever we would play, we would go out and we would play, I would strive to beat him. Now, the game of golf is meant to be against the course, but there is a bit of competition if you're playing against someone. But it never would fail whenever we would go play, no matter how well I scored, and I would call myself a decent, okay golfer, not professional, but I do okay. If I did well and I shot an 83, he would shoot an 82. If I shot an 86, he would shoot an 85. If I shot a 96, he would shoot a 95. It never failed. No matter how good or bad I did, he would always beat me, and I hated it. I hated it. So every time I would go out, I would think, I'm going to beat him. I am going to beat him. By the way, he was here earlier this summer, and we got to play golf. We connected to play golf, and I actually beat him. Just to add that in there in case he listens to this message, I did beat him the last time we played. But I never will forget this one time. I had never beaten him, and we were at this course, and we came to the 16th hole. Now, if you're not a golf fan, the golf course has 18 holes. We came to hole 16, and I was up by 2 strokes. Pretty much it's in the bag. I have to blow this thing apart to not win. And so I get up on this par 3, hole number 16. I'm ahead by 2 strokes. I am feeling confident and good. I'm playing well. I'm like, this is in the bag. I'm beating him, finally. And I hit a shot. It was a 167-yard shot. I hit an iron, and I hit it up in the air. It goes onto the green. I'm about 15 feet away from the cup. That's a great shot, by the way. I'm like, man, this is in the bag. I'm staring him down a little bit. I take the club and put it back in its sheath. And he gets up, and he hits a shot. And on the left-hand side of this course, in this hole, there's a row of houses that are protected by big trees. And so he hits a shot, and it begins to fade out into the trees. And I'm like, inside of me, if I can be honest, inside I'm like, oh, yes, this is over. The problem is this. You can't do that in golf. Like, you can't say that. You can't talk smack. It doesn't work. So I'm like, you don't say things like, it's in the trees, great shot. You don't do that. It's a gentleman's sport. That's why golf clap, bro. It's proper. So this ball goes toward the trees. My insides are just like, yes. And all of a sudden, I hear it hit a tree. It's a glorious sound. The ball hits the tree. It bounces off another tree. It goes, you can hear it from a distance. And all of a sudden, we see it shooting out onto the green 5 feet from the cup. Now, mind you, we were paired up with 2 other players. And the normal response, if you don't know golf, this is the way you should respond no matter what. That was a great shot. Amazing. Except what I did, because I didn't like it, is immediately what comes out of me very loudly is, that stinks. And these other 2 guys are looking at me saying, you're not supposed to say that on the golf course. You don't talk badly about other players. And here I am like, that stinks. I was in the lead, and you hit a shot like that. And he ended up beating me. I mean, I just fell apart after that. It messed with me. I will say I did get the last word this year beating him, but nonetheless, I never will forget. We still talk about that shot. We live a life of comparison. And when we live a life of comparison, we naturally don't want to see someone else pass us up, and if they do, it causes a stirring in us. There's a bit of fight, and two reactions happen. We fight for more value or worth, or we give up and we say, forget it, I'm never going to add up. And that's where many people live. And both of those, as we're going to see in this text, are absolutely wrong. When that overflows to our spiritual life, it will create danger. It is dangerous to live a life of comparison. Take a look here, Luke chapter 18. We see how this spiritually is dangerous and ungodly. Take a look in Luke 18. We're going to begin in verse 9. Jesus gives us a parable. It says, he also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and treated others with contempt. Verse 10, 2 men went up into the temple to pray. So the context here, there are 2 men that are praying in the temple. One a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed. Listen to this. God, I thank you that I am not like the other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. Now, if you remember last week, we talked about tax collectors, that they were looked at as outcasts. The reason for that is they were Jews hired by the Empire of Rome to cheat their own people. So they were cheats. They were looked at poorly. I mean, they were looked at as worse than any sinner because they were cheating their own people and they were profiting off their own people, and they were traitors. They were Benedict Arnolds in their day. So we have this man who's saying, at least I'm not like a tax collector. Why? Because I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get. Verse 13. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift up his eyes to heaven, but he beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. Now, what's interesting about comparison is that it may just be in this story that the information that they're seeing is true. It's true. The Pharisee is not like the unjust. He's not an adulterer. He is not like a tax collector. The point that the Pharisee is making is a true point. And the tax collector only beats his breast and says, have mercy on me, for I'm a sinner. And that is absolutely true as well. Here's the problem. The problem is not the truth or the reality of the information of which we compare. It is what we do with that information that is the problem. So here is this man in the temple, and he is praying, and he says, God, thank you that I'm not like that guy. Thank you I'm not like him. Thank you I'm not an adulterer or that guy, the tax collector. Now, you and I, we read this, and immediately we say, at least I'm not like the Pharisee. Don't we? We actually look at the text and we say, at least I'm not like him. But what do? We are actually somewhat living in that same way. In fact, one author said that what we tend to do is we put ers at the end of our word, which demonstrate comparison. Think about this for a moment. This opened my eyes. It is true. So we say things like, am I prettier? Am I taller? Am I skinnier? Am I smarter? Am I happier? Am I hipper or hipster-er? Am I more talented-er? You add to any word. What do we really want to be? We want to be superior, don't we? That's really what we're trying. We're trying to be superior over other people. Now, the instinct is when we find, and we're smart enough people to know that sometimes we don't measure up, is we then tend to see ourselves as lesser. And so we say, I am heavier, slower, shorter, poorer, I'm nerdier, whatever else you want to throw in there. And we say, well, it's not their fault, they're better than I am. So I look in the mirror and I don't like what I see. Now this overflows to every other area of life. But here's the reality. This also extends to our spiritual life. We begin to look at other people and say, man, I am not like these other folks. I read my Bible. I'm a Bibler. I pray, I'm a prayer. I actually will share with people sometimes at a restaurant I'll say something about Jesus. I am a restaurateur Jesus person. I mean, put to anything, right? Isn't that true? We put to it and it changes. It becomes like a word of comparison. And we say, look, spiritually, I'm better than them. Even though we would not say it out loud, we actually think it. We begin to compare our lives and say, at least I'm not like them, or at least I'm not like this person, and at least I'm doing this and this person isn't. So God, and here's what we're actually saying, is in comparison, God must be pretty happy with me. He should be happy. I mean, he's got to spend all of his time with these folks over here, the tax collectors. At least he doesn't have to spend that much time on me compared to them, right? That we naturally, instinctively, accidentally do this. And you can hear it in our speech sometimes. Did you hear about so-and-so? Did you hear what they're doing? Did you hear what they did? Did you hear what they said? Did you see that? What are we actually trying to say? We're trying to say, look, at where I'm at, look how God should be happy with me. We do the same thing. Now, this text is straightforward. There's no magic to it. It's straight up. But there's something very interesting that's at the beginning that gives us insight into Jesus' point. In other words, when Jesus spoke parables, there was always a point he was trying to make. We have to see the one point he's trying to make. It's not always given straightforward. In fact, the point that he's trying to make here is actually found in verse 9. This is eye-opening, these words in verse 9. Take a look at verse 9, the beginning of this story. It says, he also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and treated others with contempt. Here's what he just said. Jesus says, here is the point of this message, of this parable. It is because there are people that trust in themselves and hold contempt to other people. Now, there's two words here that are absolutely eye-opening. I think they define what comparison looks like. The first word is the word trust in themselves. It's not the typical word that you would see for trust. In fact, it's only used here in the entire New Testament. There are two words we're going to see that are only used here in the entire New Testament, and this is one of them. This word is only used here. It is the word petho or pytho. It literally means to persuade yourself with confidence. I find this very interesting. What does comparison do? Comparison is us trying to persuade ourselves of our status and worth. Jesus said here, here's the problem. People are trusting themselves. When he says that, what he meant, and this is the word he uses, is they're trying to persuade themselves of who they are. They're trying to persuade themselves. Isn't that what somebody who compares do? They're trying to persuade themselves of their own confidence. They're trying to find confidence in themselves. They're persuading themselves that they measure up. And then he says, and what ends up happening is they look at someone else with contempt. The word here is the word exutheneo, which means to count as nothing. So here's the picture that Jesus gives in the bookend of verse 9. He says, so we try to persuade ourselves of our worth, and as a result, we count everybody else as nothing. We owe ourselves something, but when I look at somebody else, I count them as cheap. They're change. They're nothing. They don't measure up. They don't count. Isn't that interesting that he begins this parable by saying there are some who try to persuade themselves of their measurement, while doing that, they look at others and count them as nothing. They actually count them as nothing. I think this teaches us very powerfully the innate urge to compare. And what we end up doing, what Jesus is really saying, is we make winners and losers. We work to make ourselves winners, and whenever there's a winner, there's got to be a loser, and it's somebody else. Now, at the core of this, I'm going to say it straight up, what the core of comparison, at the core of it is none other than the great I word, pride. And the center letter in the word pride is what? I. It's arrogance. Now, when I say that, let me just be honest. Most of us probably look at pride as, okay, Dave, we get it, it's prideful. Blah, blah, blah. We look at it as a very small sin, don't we? We kind of look at pride as a sin in between forgetting to floss and driving too fast. Pride somewhere in the middle. It's not that bad. I'm not a murderer. I'm not an adulterer. I'm not unrighteous. I just got a little bit of pride. And I forget to floss sometimes, and I forget the speed limit. So somewhere in between there, and so God. Do you realize what's interesting is, and we could go to the Old Testament and see, in fact, in Proverbs 6, there's a statement that God says he hates 6 things, yes, 7 things, and the first thing he says is haughty eyes. The word haughty is actually the word to set yourself up in authority. In fact, the New Testament Greek version of that word is found in this text. Take a look at verse 14. Jesus says, I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled. This word, exalt, is the word hupsao. It is the word to mean to exalt or to set up higher than reality. In other words, that's the word for pride. We set ourselves in a status or a measurement higher than what is reality. And at the core, guess what that is? That's pride and arrogance. And Jesus said here, if you exalt yourself, you will then be humbled. Now, I want to pause here, and here's the question I want to ask. We clearly understand that we compare. But do we have an answer to that? And I believe not only does Scripture give us an answer, Jesus himself actually addressed this topic in a sermon he preached. And the question I want to ask in this text, and we're going to come back to it, is in verse 13. Why is this tax collector who beats his chest and says, have mercy on me, a sinner, why does it say that he leaves justified, which means to be declared right? How is he declared right when the Pharisee is the one who's doing right? How does this look? How does this work? Well, the answer is given in a sermon that Jesus preached. Let's turn back to Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5. It is what is called the Sermon on the Mount. And I believe chapter 5 is the sermon that is lived out in Luke 18. Okay, so we're going to come back to Luke 18. But I believe this actually begins with a sermon that Jesus preached. This sermon is called the Sermon on the Mount. There are probably thousands of people there on the Mount of Olives overseeing the Sea of Galilee who are listening to Jesus teach this sermon on this Mount Discourse, this sermon that he gives on the Mount. And it begins with well-known passage in the beginning as he goes up the Mount where he says, blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who mourn, and this well-known sermon. Now this is, by the way, the longest sermon that Jesus preaches. If you read it, it probably takes you 10 minutes. Go ahead and say it, Dave, you've got a lot to learn. This is a power-packed sermon, and it actually was meant to flip their thoughts upside down. I mean, if you read this, if you were a Jewish person and you were hearing this sermon for the first time, this would actually turn your world upside down, this sermon. And we're going to look at just a part of it. Take a look at verse 17. Jesus says, and again, this is meant to turn their thinking upside down. He says, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. The word abolish means to throw away. I haven't come to throw them away. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota or a dot will pass from the law. An iota was the smallest point in the Hebrew alphabet. It's the marking of one of the letters. It's a dot, and it marks one of the letters and describes how to pronounce it. It is the Greek version of that little dot. The yod is called in Hebrew. Verse 19, therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. By the way, notice they're not going to not be in the kingdom of heaven. He says they're going to be least in the kingdom. Very important. But whoever does them and teaches them will be great in the kingdom of heaven. Now, if you stop here, and many people stop the text here, and they say, we ought to obey all the Old Testament laws. We ought to fulfill them, live them, obey them. Jesus didn't come to get rid of them. He came to fulfill them. We ought to keep them all. Here's the problem. If you stop here, it would seem like obeying the law is like a badge of courage. Let me just be honest with you. I think we're in that culture today where there's this divide about what does it mean to follow Christ, because you have some books that'll say you need to forsake all, you need to abandon everything, you need to give up everything. In fact, they would say things like, I was reading a book that said your relationship with Jesus requires absolute, undivided, and exclusive affection. I'm in trouble because I am easily distracted. Now, am I not saying that Jesus doesn't deserve that? Yes. The problem is when I try to attain that, I can't do it. And that's the problem, is it almost seems as if spiritual burnout is a badge of courage. If I just burn out for Jesus, he'll be happy. That doesn't work. That's not his point. If you just read this text, it would be you need to obey all the law. If you don't obey them, you're in trouble. Jesus takes it a step further. Do not miss verse 19 with verse 20. Notice verse 20. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. No reaction. No gasp. No. See, if you were sitting there in the first century listening to the sermon, every single Jew who sat there would have been like, what? This would have been the moment they all look at each other going, Did you just hear what he said? Unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. Let me put it in our day's term. Unless you witness to as many people as Billy Graham, you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. What? I'm done. I'm out. Unless your righteousness is great, you can't. I mean, he just made a standard that every single Jew would have said, impossible. No way. Now, even by the way, if you were a Pharisee, he just slapped you in the face. If you were a Pharisee, he actually just backhanded the Pharisees. Let me explain why. He uses two words to describe what they ought to do. Look at these two words. It's powerful. He says you ought to exceed. The word is periseo, which means to exceed a fixed number of measurement. So if the standard are the Pharisees, you need to exceed that. And then he adds another word to it. It's the word pleon, which means of superior or greater quantity. Here is exactly what Jesus is saying in verse 20. He's saying, unless your righteousness exceeds the Pharisees and beyond. Literally, he's saying your righteousness has to exceed the Pharisees and then go further. In the words of Buzz Lightyear, to infinity and beyond. You can't just be as good as a Pharisee. So if we think here that Jesus is saying, let's become a Pharisee, that would be great. Jesus says, no, you got to be better than a Pharisee and then go beyond that. It would be like for you Trekkie fans out there, the Starship USS Enterprise on a 5-year mission to go boldly where no man has gone before, to go beyond, right? Live long and prosperous. I'm not a Trekkie. I make fun of Trekkies, so. That's what Jesus is saying. You better surpass the Pharisees if you're going to get to heaven. Now, every single one of us should look at this and be like, I'm out. Can't do it. Can't make it. Jesus takes it one step further, and what he does, he takes the script that he just preached and now flips it to show how deep he's talking about. And he gives 6 examples. I'm just going to run through these quickly, don't worry. These 6 examples that he gives and what it looks like to surpass the scribes and Pharisees. Take a look at verse 21. And it begins, every one of them begins with, you have heard it said, but I say. Every one of them will start with this, and then he says, but I say to you. Verse 21, you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council. And whoever says you fool will be liable to the hell of fire. Now stop right there for a moment. Thou shalt not murder. But if you're angry with a brother or sister, anyone, you've committed murder in your heart if you're angry against them. It can build in you. By the way, doesn't murder begin with anger? Like you don't murder somebody you're not angry with. That usually doesn't happen in our world. You're usually angry with somebody, so I'm going to kill someone. It starts with a thought. And Jesus says, listen, you can say you're not murdering, but there's something deeper if you have anger toward your brother. He goes on. Again, this is one example. He gives 6 of them. He goes on, verse 27. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out, for it is better that you lose one of your members than your whole body. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off, throw it away, for it is better that you lose one of your members than your whole body go into hell. So, he says, don't commit adultery, right? You've heard that said. That's a command. It's one of the 10 commandments. Thou shalt not commit adultery. But I say to you, if you have lustful thoughts towards somebody, you've committed adultery in your heart. Anybody here ever think lustful thoughts? You don't have to raise your hand. If we did, everybody's hand would go up, right? We'd all would go up. We've thought lustful thoughts, and Jesus says, if that's the case, you ought to pluck your eye out and cut your hand off. I look around, and I don't see anybody with only one eye. I don't see anybody with that. I don't see anybody that has their hand cut off. I do have to tell you the story. After the second service, somebody came up to me and here to find out they had a fake eye. And they came up, they took their pen and tapped it. I'm like, oh, what did you just do? That's weird. And he was like, well, actually, I was going to stand up when you said, I bet you there's no one here that has only one eye. And I was going to say, actually, I do. But he said, I didn't want to interrupt your sermon. He actually had one eye. But We all probably have two eyes. We haven't plucked them out because that's not Jesus' point here. Again, Jesus, and we're going to get to the end of the message and see exactly where he's going, but he is raising the bar. Thou shalt not commit adultery. I don't. But I have a lustful thought in my heart. I've committed adultery. I'm guilty. Verse 31, it was also said, whoever divorces a wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that anyone who divorces a wife except on the ground of sexual immorality makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Verse 33, again you have heard it said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn. But I say to you, don't take an oath at all, either by heaven, or which is God's throne, or by earth, which is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. Verse 37, let what you say be simply yes or no. It was a common in their day to go and to proclaim this promise and say, I swear by heaven, I swear by earth, I swear by Jerusalem. And God says, listen, don't do that. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. Let your word be your word. You don't have to swear and make an oath by anything. We live in a day of contracts. Got to have a contract. And that contract is now binding. But Jesus is saying, let your yes be yes. I try to teach my boys that. They say, do you promise? I say, I don't promise. If I said yes, I'll do it. If I say no, I'm going to do it. I'm not going to do it. Verse 36 or 38, you have heard that it is said, an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. But if someone slaps you on the right cheek, turn him and give him the other also. And if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go a mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who you would borrow from. This is meant to be funny, by the way, because he says, if anyone asks for your cloak, give him your tunic as well. The tunic was actually the undergarment. So literally in our translation today, it would say, if someone asks for your coat, not only give him your coat, give him your underwear. Literally, that's what it is. It's the garment next to the skin. I just think that would be funny if somebody said, can I borrow your coat? And you go, yeah, but I got something else for you. And I mean, I imagine the reaction would be like, oh, I don't want your coat anymore. But that's exactly what he's saying here. It's give him not only your outer garment, give him your undergarment as well. And I think Jesus here may have been a little laughter when Jesus said that. Again, he's raising the bar. I mean, we've heard it say an eye for an eye. When someone hurts us, we get them back. Someone pranks us, we prank them back. Someone says something bad about us, we'll say something back. Jesus says here, no. Instead, turn the cheek. Instead, give them the way. He goes on. Again, we're just hitting these lightly. This is a whole other sermon series on the 6 messages here. Verse 43, and I believe this is the ultimate. This is the penultimate of Jesus' sermon. This reflects all of it. I'll tell you why, because all of them have to do with people and relationships. And so he says, verse 43, and you have heard it said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of the Father who is in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and the unjust. He says here, listen, you've heard it say, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. I say, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Now, as we read that right away, we should all feel this weight of like, oh my, I'm in trouble. Outwardly, I'm pretty good. I'm not an adulterer, or I'm not a murderer. I haven't killed an enemy. And granted, I want to make sure we understand he's not talking about national things. People try to defy the Old and New Testament. No, there's a difference between national realities and personal individual realities. So if you try to say, well, he's telling us we should never go to war, that's not his point. There are national realities that we see in the Old Testament because he's dealing with a nation, and now he deals with us individually. That's the picture here. We are all out of the boat here. We all sink. And Jesus takes it one step further. He's taken the script, he's flipped it, and now he goes one step further. Take a look at verse 46. He says, for if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Don't the tax collectors do that? If you greet only your brothers, what are you doing more than others? Don't the Gentiles do that? He says, listen, if you want to compare, you're always going to find somebody who you compare with. In fact, the ones you compare with are the ones you don't like. There's always somebody doing these things. He says this, here is his point. He bookends this message by saying, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees and goes beyond it. And then he says in verse 48, you therefore must be what? perfect, the word teleos, it means that you're able to complete yourself. You have everything necessary to complete yourself as your heavenly Father is perfect. Anybody want to take out their number 2 pencil and fill in the little dot that says, I can do that? We all fall short, right? Scribes and Pharisees and beyond can't do it. But even if you could, anybody here want to say I'm perfect as my heavenly Father is perfect? Absolutely not. All of us are smart enough to realize we are not ever going to measure up. And that is Jesus' point. Jesus' point is this. When you begin to compare, what ultimately you come back to is perfection. And in perfection, we do not add up. The ground is level before God. What he does is he levels the playing field of the Pharisee and the tax collector, of the righteous and the unrighteous, of the one who thinks they've got it and the one who doesn't. And he says the ground is level. The playing field is level. He challenges the status quo and he says, listen, it's more than just external standards. He says, listen, the law is meant to reveal that we can't do it. The law is meant to be a mirror in which we see we cannot accomplish. It never will fix our problem, though. The law is meant to show us we can't keep it. Why? So that we now say, God, I can't keep it because inside my heart is messed up. Inside I can't do this. In the end, what God's concerned about is not just our actions, but our attitude. Not just our external, but our internal. And so he says, you've heard it said, but let me tell you, there's something deeper than just the outward actions. You may not be an adulterer or murderer, but there's something deeper when we sin that's taking place, and what is in will come out. Now, here's the question I want to ask, and we're going to spend just a few minutes on, and we're going to answer. Who or what am I using as a reference point to measure my life? Who or what right now in my life am I using as a measuring point, a reference point, to measure how well I'm doing spiritually? Who is it? What is it? There are probably just 2 options if we're really being honest. First of all, there's people. So we can look at other people like the Pharisee, and many of us do this, and say, I must be good because I'm not like them. God must be happy with me. And here's what's the problem with that. There are 2 ways we compare people. First of all, we compare people that are farther along than us, people that have advanced farther than us, and we begin to see people that we admire and will hope to be. Now, let me just say, I think it's absolutely healthy to have models that we look at. I believe it's healthy to have people who are examples of the faith. Here's the problem. When we put our faith and building our faith like their faith, what happens if they fail? We've all been in those situations before where somebody we look up to fails. So if we're using people as a comparison, what happens when we look up at them and then they fail us is it crashes our world. We don't want to be them anymore. Now we don't know what to be. So by looking up toward people, what happens, even in a good way, it can be very, very dangerous. You're here this morning and you might say, man, if I just had their life, their faith, their spirituality, my life would be much better. And that can, by the way, plays out practically. If you're here and you're saying, if I just had their marriage, if I just had their kids, if I just had their finances or their job, my life would be so much better. Can I tell you something? That never wins. It never wins. I mean, let's be honest. You go up to your spouse and you say, man, if you just looked like her, that never wins. If you go up to your kids and you say, I wish you could be like those kids, it never wins for anybody. It never solves the problem. Why? Comparison to other people never solves the situation. It always is a lose-lose. It always a lose-lose. But we could also look at people, and not only people that are better than us, we could look at people lesser than us and say, man, I certainly don't want to be like them ever. And we begin to lower the standard and say, I never want to be like them. So probably all of us here can say, we're pretty good compared to ISIS. We're pretty good compared to Al-Qaeda. Man, we're pretty good compared to them. I mean, clearly God's got his attention on them. They need the righteous judgment of God to come down on them. Do you see? Now, I'm not saying we don't compare, and that's not reality, because all of us are probably better than ISIS people. I hope we are. If you're not, we have a security team here ready to take you out. But say, I would never want to be like them. And the danger is, by saying we never want to be like them, we stay at a status point or a measuring point that never takes us further. See, measuring people never works. I want to tell you 3 reasons why I believe measuring our lives, comparing our lives to people never works. And then we're going to look at the answer. It never works because of this. First of all, I rarely know the story of other people. I really don't know what's happening in the core of their lives. I don't know what's taking place behind the scenes. I know people that I have seen who look the part, yet inwardly were distraught and overcome. I rarely can see the entire story of what's happening in someone's life. By the way, did we not just see that in the news this week with some well-known athletes? We thought better of them, and it came out of what was happening behind the scenes, and it destroys us. We rarely know the true story behind what's happening in someone's life. Secondly, our conclusions are usually wrong. If you remember last week, I said if we were in the first century and we saw the Pharisees, we would not have said, oh, them? We would have said, wow, them? They were magnificent people. They were looked at as the status of all people. They were the elevated religious people. But we didn't know what's happening in their hearts. See, until Jesus comes on the scene and reveals the heart, we would think they were the people we ought to be like. So our conclusions about people are usually wrong. And so if you're here and you're saying, well, I want what they have or I don't want what they have, you may not have any clue what they're about. You have no clue what's going on the inside. I have met people that I thought by their look aren't following Christ, follow Christ more intensely than people that look the part but really aren't. So our conclusions are usually wrong. Thirdly and lastly, I don't know about you, but I am incredibly biased when I compare. In other words, if I'm going to compare, I'm going to make sure that I compare to make myself come out on top. If I'm picking for kickball, I'm picking the best. It's our nature, right? We are biased in our comparisons to make ourselves come out on top. And here's what happens. Here's the danger. Follow me for a moment. Is self-deception sneaks in. And what ends up happening is people that are higher than we are or farther along than we are, even in the faith, what we really begin to want is for them to fail. Because if they fail, I feel better. I'm not as bad. See, self-deception starts to set in, and what we actually want is someone to fail so that we feel better. This is dangerous. So what does the Bible give? What Jesus gave in the Sermon on the Mount. What I believe Luke 18, the tax collector, gets is our comparison should not be people. Our comparison should be Christ himself. And let me explain this for a moment. Do you find it interesting? Let's turn back to Luke 18. That nowhere do we see the tax collector comparing himself to anyone else. He never says, well, at least I'm not the prostitute at the temple, the pagan temple. At least I'm not that person. He doesn't, does he? Instead, he beats his own chest. He doesn't even look up. He beats his own chest and says, God. He compares himself to Christ, to God. For us, that's the comparison we have to start with. That's where we should compare, is what are we like before God, Christ. Not just comparison to people, but comparison of Christ himself. And I want to focus on verse 13 because he says something here that is absolutely astounding that we probably read over and didn't grasp. Luke 18, verse 13, he says, but the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift up his eyes to heaven, but, listen to this, beat his breast, and he said, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. Now, what's interesting here is we read this and think, okay, he's crying out for mercy because he knows he's a sinner and needs it. No. This word mercy is actually a totally different word for mercy than we see anywhere else. In fact, this word only shows up here in the entire New Testament. This is the only place it shows up. It's the only place it's used in Jesus giving this story. It is a unique word. The word here, mercy, is not the normal word, God have mercy upon me. This word actually is a beautiful word. It's the word hilaskomai. Hilaskomai. And it means literally to become propitious or to appease. Now, I know I just used a big word, propitious. What does that mean, propitiation? Well, let me tell you. Propitiation means that that I'm going to gain the victory. I'm going to go after the victory. I'm going to satisfy my need myself. The tax collector doesn't do that. In other words, I'm going to succeed. I'm going to go after it. The Bible makes clear that Jesus is our propitiation. Here's what this tax collector does. He says, God, would you help me get victory? He's not proclaiming victory. He's actually helping for it. He's asking for it. God, would you have mercy? God, would you appease my need? Would you help me succeed where I can't? Would you help me be able to do what I cannot do? Would you, God, secure for me the victory that I can never win? I'm never going to measure up. In other words, he's saying, God, would you give me my measuring tape? Would you give me my status? Would you give me my worth because I can't get it? That's his cry here. It's this unique word where he says, would you be the one to secure victory because I can't? And Jesus ends this by saying, that man leaves declared right. Notice he didn't do anything to change. Clearly this changed him, but we don't know what happened. He didn't come and clean his life up first. He came and he said, God, I can't do it. I can't find worth and status. I don't measure up to anyone else. Have mercy. Would you win it for me? Isn't that what Jesus did for us? Didn't he answer the question of comparison? I mean, our righteousness has nothing to do with our behavior. No, it was God who scandalously applies righteousness to our sin-drenched souls out of his own pure generosity. He initiated, he did that. I want to consider what Paul writes to Titus. He said, for we ourselves were once foolish, disobedient, led astray, slaves to various passions and pleasures, passing our days in malice and envy, hated by others and hating one another. Isn't that all of us? That's Jesus' sermon right there, is it not? Jesus said, hey, we hate one another. And in that we've committed murder. We're disobedient, we've led astray. But when the goodness, and there's one of those big buts, if you like to underline them in the Bible, but when the goodness and loving kindness of God, our Savior, appeared, he saved us. Not by works that we have done in righteousness. Not because we've been good, not because we've measured up, not because we've gained it. No. Instead, but according to his mercy, totally different word here, by the way, by the washing of regeneration and renewal of the Holy Spirit, whom he poured out on us richly through Jesus Christ our Savior, so that being justified by his grace, we might become heirs according to the hope of eternal life. In other words, Jesus' gruesome death, the gruesome death of the all-glorious, innocent, loving Son of God, is actually a declaration or an indictment on my hopeless state. I hate to admit it, but I can't do it. I hate to do that. I always think I can do it. The fact that Jesus had to die is an indictment against that thought, that self-reliance, self-confidence, and self-comparison never are going to work, that it doesn't work at the cross. Instead, Jesus succeeded where I failed. Instead, he obeyed where I disobeyed. Instead, he was perfect where I sinned. Instead, he kept the perfect requirement of the law where I couldn't. And in that, folks, listen, if we grasp this, when I compare to Christ, I don't measure up. But Christ doesn't leave us not measuring up. In fact, what Christ does is realizing we can't measure up, reaches us to him, presses us into him, and what he does now is reinstitute, re-engage, remake value and worth. Listen, I never have to compare to somebody else. If God went to the cross for me, then what greater thing do I need to compare to? I mean, if he died for me, I should feel I'm unworthy yet worthy at the same time. I'm undeserving yet given deserve at the same time. I am worthless yet made worthwhile in the fact that he went to the cross. See, there should never be the need to compare to someone else, because in him I find value, in him I find worth, in him I find a gift that is immeasurable, so that I never have to measure against someone else. If you measure your lives according to other people, let me just tell you, you're measuring yourself according to yourself. We're all in the same boat. And it's like the stock market. You'll find something better and then there'll be something bad. But when you measure your life to Christ, guess what happens? You always fall short, but when you fall short, Jesus reaches out his hand and pulls us up to where he is. In our inadequacy, he provides what's lacking. In our inability, he provides ability. In our pride, he reminds us that, hey, you have no basis for it. In our weakness, he becomes strong. Why would I ever want to compare to somebody else?